Welcome to Heart of Terra Stories. Please subscribe to my channel. Your one click means the world to me. The steam rising from the blackened skillet wasn't just heat, it was a gamble. Mateo didn't look up, even as the Archon's guards shifted their weight, their translucent skin pulsing a rhythmic, sickly violet. On the raised dais, here Sora leaned forward, her breaths coming in ragged, shallow whistles. The radiant glow that supposedly defined her lineage had dimmed to a dull, bruised gray. Mateo flipped the grain, the hiss of the sear cutting through the suffocating silence of the great hall. It smelled of scorched earth and something sweet, like dying flowers. He knew the Archon was watching his every move, fingers twitching near the hilt of a crystalline blade. One bite would either save a dying dynasty or be the last thing Mateo ever cooked. It had started 3 solar cycles ago when the aura first broke through the prismatic clouds of Xylos Minor. Commander Elias Thorne had expected a grand welcome, a meeting of minds and technologies. Instead, they found a civilization literally rotting from the inside out. The Xylosians were a people of deep, unyielding tradition, bound to the divine grains harvested from the Lumina plains. For centuries, these crops had sustained them, but the soil had changed. Toxic minerals had leached into the roots, and the very food they considered sacred had become a slow-acting venom. Archon Valerius had been desperate, his pride crumbling alongside his daughter's health. He had welcomed the humans not for their engines or their star charts, but for their biology. Yet it wasn't the ship's medbay that found the answer. It was the kitchen. While Elias navigated the stiff, formal tensions of the court, Mateo had been down in the soil. He'd spent hours watching the Xylosian harvesters, noting how they handled the grain with a reverence that bordered on the suicidal. They wouldn't wash it, they wouldn't grind it. They ate it raw, just as their ancestors had during the Age of First Light. But the Age of First Light didn't have heavy metal runoff in the water table. Tradition is a guide, not a cage, Mateo had whispered to Sora during a quiet moment in the gardens, away from her father's suffocating gaze. She had looked at him with wide, weary eyes, her hands trembling as she touched a wilted leaf. She didn't understand why the humans insisted on breaking the food before eating it. To her, the heat was a violation. To Mateo, it was the only way to break the chemical bonds of the toxins. He had spent 48 hours straight in the Aura's galley, running simulations. He discovered that a specific strain of Terran lactobacillus, when introduced to the Xylosian grain in a controlled ferment, could actually metabolize the pollutants. Follow that with high-intensity heat to denature the remaining alkaloids, and you didn't just have a meal, you had a cure. Now, in the heart of the capital, the pressure was physical. The air felt thick, charged with the desperation of a world on the brink. Mateo scooped the charred, fermented grains into a small ceramic bowl. No gold, no silver, just the food. He stepped toward Sora, the heat from the bowl warming his palms. He could feel the Archon's eyes like needles against his neck. Healing a world, Mateo muttered under his breath. One recipe at a time, he reached the dais and knelt, holding the bowl out. Sora looked at her father, then at the smoking, transformed offering. The scent was sharp, alien, and entirely new. Sora's fingers were pale, almost translucent, as they reached for the small wooden spoon. The Archon's hand tightened on the arm of his throne, his knuckles white. To him this was a desecration of the divine grain, a surrender of their history to a species that smelled of metal and salt. But Sora didn't look at her father. She looked at the steam. She looked at the way the light caught the golden, caramelized edges of the fermented mash. She took the first bite. The silence in the hall was absolute. For a moment she simply sat there, her eyes closed, the heat of the grain blooming in her chest. Then she took another, and another. The rhythmic whistling of her breath began to smooth into a steady, deep resonance. A glow restored by the heat of a human kitchen didn't happen all at once. It started as a flicker beneath her collarbone, a soft bioluminescent pulse that began to push back the gray. It was the sound of a heart finding its rhythm again. The Archon stood, his expression a chaotic map of fear and dawning hope. He stepped down from the dais, his own pulse erratic, and took the bowl from his daughter's hands. He tasted the fire. He tasted the sour, sharp tang of the fermentation, the literal flavor of the bacteria stripping away the death that had lived in his soil. The diplomacy that followed didn't happen over star charts or trade manifests. It happened right there, on the floor of the Great Hall, as Matteo brought out more blackened skillets. The Aura's crew brought down crates of the Terran cultures, explaining the process of bioremediation, how they could seed the Lumina plains with these same microscopic allies to heal the land itself. By the time the third moon rose, the divine grains were being transformed across the city. The harsh, searing heat of the human stoves was no longer seen as a violation, but as a catalyst. The Xylosians learned that their heritage wasn't found in the raw, stagnant state of the past, but in the ability to adapt and survive. Standing on the boarding ramp of the Aura as they prepared for departure, Matteo looked back at Lumina City. Sora stood at the gates, her skin radiating a vibrant, healthy amber that lit up the night. She raised a hand, a gesture of quiet, profound connection that bypassed the need for translators. "The best diplomacy," Elias remarked, standing beside him as the engines began their low hum, "really does happen around the dinner table." Matteo just nodded, cleaning a stray smudge of char from his thumb. They hadn't just saved a princess, they'd taught a world how to eat again. The Aura lifted, leaving the luminous orb of Xylos Minor behind, a planet no longer rotting, but breathing.